Imagine a world in ruins. A generation buried in muddy trenches, empires collapsed, and entire cities reduced to ghost towns. It's 1918, and World War I, the war to end all wars, has just concluded. Millions are dead. Millions more are wounded in body and mind. The world is desperate for peace. But what if I told you the treaty meant to end the war didn't bring peace at all? It planted the seeds for the most destructive conflict in human history. This is the story of how a single treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, signed in a gilded hall of mirrors, shattered the illusion of peace and dragged the world into chaos again just 2 decades later. The men who gathered in Paris in 1919 weren't just politicians. They were kings without crowns, victors with scars, and dreamers haunted by blood. Woodrow Wilson came with his idealism, selling the dream of a League of Nations and peace through diplomacy. David Lloyd George arrived with his British pragmatism, trying to balance punishment and stability. And Georges Clemenceau? The French tiger came thirsting for vengeance. His nation had been scarred by German boots twice in a single lifetime, and he wanted payback. But where was Germany in all this? Nowhere. The defeated were not allowed to sit at the table where their future would be decided. They were summoned only at the end, like criminals to hear their sentence. The world called it diplomacy. History would call it a disaster. Germany, broken and humiliated, was forced to accept full responsibility for the war under Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. But here's what the textbooks don't emphasize. Germany didn't just accept guilt. They were bled dry. The treaty demanded reparations equivalent to over $400 billion in today's money. Their colonies were stripped, their military reduced to a skeleton force, and their pride crushed beneath the boots of foreign occupiers. On June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, German representatives signed the treaty. They did so under protest, calling it a dictated peace, a diktat. As the ink dried, German rage ignited. A rising nationalist leader named Adolf Hitler, then a failed artist and former soldier, watched with burning eyes as his country was disgraced. In that moment, the spark was lit. The fuse had been set. But how did a piece of paper signed in a French palace lead to another world war? Let's rewind. After the treaty was enforced, Germany's economy collapsed. Hyperinflation hit like a plague. In 1923, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Middle-class families lost their life savings overnight. People literally burned cash to stay warm. Chaos replaced currency. In the shadows of this desperation, extremist ideologies flourished. And here's the kicker: the Allies thought they were securing peace by crushing Germany. But all they did was crush the only moderate voices left. As political chaos surged and governments fell like dominoes, people began looking not for democracy, but for deliverance. Someone to restore dignity, order, and identity. That someone was already practicing speeches in beer halls. Hitler used the Treaty of Versailles like a weapon. Every article, every clause, every economic punishment became a rallying cry. Germany was stabbed in the back, he declared. We didn't lose the war on the battlefield. We were betrayed by weak leaders and foreign conspiracies. It didn't matter that this wasn't entirely true. What mattered was that it felt true to millions of angry, unemployed, and humiliated citizens. Meanwhile, the League of Nations, created by the same treaty to protect peace, turned out to be a paper tiger. It had no army, no real power. And ironically, the United States, the country that proposed it, refused to join. Wilson's dream was dead on arrival, blocked by his own Senate. So here's the irony. The treaty that was meant to guarantee peace created the exact conditions in which peace could never survive. Borders were redrawn without understanding local cultures. New nations were created overnight, often ignoring centuries of history. Ethnic tensions exploded. From Eastern Europe to the Middle East, the Treaty of Versailles didn't just break Germany, it broke the world. And as the 1920s turned into the 1930s, the wounds festered. Germany wasn't alone in its resentment. Italy, despite being on the winning side, felt betrayed by what they called the Mutilated victory. Japan, too, walked away disillusioned when its proposal for racial equality was ignored. The seeds of World War II weren't just planted in Berlin. They were scattered across the globe. Now picture this: a charismatic leader rises. He promises to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. He vows to make Germany strong again. He points to the treaty as the ultimate betrayal. And the people? They cheer. Loudly. But Hitler wasn't alone. Mussolini in Italy. Militarists in Japan. All emerged from the vacuum left behind by Versailles. And as the world watched, paralyzed by fear or distracted by economic depression, these regimes began testing the boundaries. Germany rearmed. Violating the treaty. No response. Germany marched into the Rhineland. Still no response. Germany annexed Austria. Nothing again. Sudetenland? Go ahead, take it. Just keep the peace. Each act of aggression was rooted in one justification. We are reclaiming what Versailles stole from us. What's more terrifying than a war? A war that everyone saw coming, and did nothing to stop. By 1939, the world was standing on the edge of a cliff. And the treaty that was supposed to ensure peace had become the platform from which Hitler would leap into conquest. This wasn't just a diplomatic failure. It was a historical trap, one laid by the very hands that had signed for peace. And the final twist? The same Hall of Mirrors where Germany was humiliated in 1919 would be the same place Hitler forced the French to sign their surrender in 1940. A revenge, cold and cruel, sealed in the exact room where it all began. This is how Versailles didn't end the war. It paused it. And in that pause, rage fermented, ideologies sharpened, and history repeated itself, with even deadlier consequences. The years after the Treaty of Versailles weren't years of peace. They were years of waiting. Like a volcano that had been sealed instead of released, pressure was building beneath the surface. But few understood how deep the cracks ran, until the tremors began. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. What should have been a bureaucratic political post turned into a launching pad for dictatorship. Within weeks, civil liberties were suspended. Within months, political opposition vanished. And within a year, Germany had transformed from a struggling democracy into a totalitarian machine fueled by hatred, nationalism, and revenge. The Treaty of Versailles, once a document collecting dust in libraries, was now plastered on propaganda posters, shouted through loudspeakers, and embedded in every speech Hitler gave. It was the cornerstone of his rhetoric. The treaty wasn't just Germany's shame, it was his weapon. And the world? It was watching, and hesitating. Britain and France, exhausted from World War I, weren't eager to fight again. Their economies were weak, their citizens weary, and their leaders convinced that diplomacy, no matter how humiliating, was better than another war. They called it appeasement. History would call it surrender by another name. But to understand how Versailles led directly to World War II, we have to look beyond Germany. Because the treaty didn't just humiliate one nation, it redrew the world map in dangerous ways. In Eastern Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dismantled into fragile new nations, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and more. These states were ethnically diverse, politically unstable, and completely unprepared for what was coming. The new borders, drawn hastily by men who barely knew the regions they divided, became future battlegrounds. Poland was reborn from the ashes of empires, but it was a nation built on borrowed land, German land, Russian land, and Austrian land. It became a target from day one. For Germany, the existence of Poland was a permanent insult, a daily reminder of defeat. And Hitler never forgot it. In the Middle East, secret deals like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, hidden even from some of the negotiators at Versailles, carved up the Ottoman Empire like a feast for the victors. France took Syria and Lebanon. Britain grabbed Iraq and Palestine. The Arab world, promised independence in exchange for fighting the Ottomans, was betrayed. The effects of these betrayals still burn today. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini rose to power by exploiting the same anger and humiliation. Italy had fought on the winning side in World War I, but Versailles gave them scraps. They wanted more land, more respect, more recognition. Instead, they got a slap in the face. Mussolini promised to restore the Roman Empire. Hitler promised to erase Versailles. Japan promised to dominate Asia. 3 different nations, 3 different cultures, but one shared enemy, the world order created in 1919. And so, the 1930s became a decade of rearmament, invasion, and silence. In 1935, Hitler announced the reintroduction of conscription. It was a direct violation of the treaty. But did the League of Nations stop him? No. In 1936, he marched troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, another clear violation. Still, no response. France could have stopped him then. Britain could have intervened. But neither did. They believed it was too minor to risk war over. But Hitler didn't see it as minor. He saw it as a green light. Every time Hitler broke the treaty and got away with it, the myth grew: Germany was rising again. Versailles was being dismantled, one clause at a time. And Hitler was the man making it happen. Then came 1938. Austria was annexed in what Hitler called the Anschluss. It was bloodless, almost theatrical. The German-speaking Austrians welcomed him with flowers and salutes. No shots were fired. The world was stunned, but again, said nothing. Next came Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland, a German-speaking region, was Hitler's next target. He claimed he only wanted to protect ethnic Germans. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and returned waving a piece of paper, proudly declaring, "Peace for our time." But what no one realized was that Hitler wasn't bluffing. He never had been. Czechoslovakia was abandoned. No war was declared. And Hitler? He took the rest of the country soon after, proving that his promises meant nothing. The appeasement strategy wasn't just failing, it was emboldening a dictator. And underneath all of this was the Treaty of Versailles, twisting history, justifying aggression, and feeding the fire. By 1939, Germany had become a war machine. Its economy had been rebuilt through state spending, arms production, and a focus on national pride. Unemployment had plummeted. Morale was high. The Nazis controlled every aspect of life. And Hitler, now the undisputed Führer, had one final grievance left to correct: Poland. Hitler wanted the Polish corridor, land that separated mainland Germany from East Prussia. He demanded it. He threatened war over it. And this time, Britain and France said, enough. They guaranteed Poland's independence. But Hitler didn't care. He'd already made a secret pact with Stalin, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that divided Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. A shocking alliance between 2 mortal enemies, bound by a temporary convenience. On September 1, 1939, German tanks rolled into Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. The Treaty of Versailles, once praised as the peace to end all wars, had instead laid the perfect trap. Its punishments gave rise to resentment. Its borders created instability. Its diplomatic failures empowered monsters. And when war returned, it was bigger, bloodier, and more global than ever before. But this is not just the story of how the treaty led to World War II. This is the story of how the consequences of Versailles never really ended. Because what came next would reshape the planet in ways no one at that Paris table could have imagined. The world was at war again. But this time, the guns were louder, the alliances more tangled, and the stakes unimaginably higher. When Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, it wasn't just about territory. It was about revenge, power, and rewriting the humiliation carved into the pages of the Treaty of Versailles. For the Nazis, the war wasn't merely a military campaign, it was a moral reckoning. Every bullet, every bomb, every step forward was painted as justice for the injustice of 1919. Hitler told his people they were reclaiming destiny. And many believed him. They had seen Versailles turn their empire into rubble. Now they watched it being rebuilt on blood. But the world wouldn't stand by this time. Britain and France declared war. The United States, though initially neutral, began preparing. The Soviet Union, for a moment, played both sides, taking its piece of Poland as agreed with Hitler, until the Nazis turned on them, too. The dominoes fell, one by one, across the continents. And yet, even as battles raged from North Africa to the Pacific, the shadow of the Versailles Treaty loomed large. It was the blueprint for what not to do. The lesson too late learned. The reason so many world leaders hesitated, afraid of repeating the mistakes of the past. The Germans rolled through Europe with terrifying speed. France fell within weeks. The same France that had dictated the harshest terms of Versailles in 1919 now watched its capital occupied by Nazi troops. And Hitler? He orchestrated his revenge with theatrical precision. On June 22, 1940, the French were forced to sign their surrender in a railway carriage at Compiègne, the exact spot where Germany had been humiliated in 1918. But Hitler didn't stop there. After they signed, he had the carriage destroyed. For him, this wasn't just victory. It was vengeance scripted for history itself. Meanwhile, the nations created or reshaped by Versailles were crumbling. Czechoslovakia was gone. Poland had been split in half. The Balkans were engulfed in chaos. Everywhere Versailles had drawn lines, war was now crossing them in fire. But Hitler's obsession with destroying the treaty wasn't just about borders. It was about people. The Treaty of Versailles had turned Germany inward, isolated, bitter, and ashamed. That internal rot became fertile ground for Nazi ideology. Jews, communists, Slavs, Roma, and others were scapegoated as the reason for Germany's decline. What began as propaganda turned into policies. What began as policies turned into genocide. The Holocaust didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a nation that had been systematically humiliated, then radicalized. Versailles didn't create anti-Semitism, but it helped create the political conditions where such hatred could become state policy. Hitler promised redemption through racial purity and revenge. And millions followed. Across the globe, other dictators took notes. In Italy, Mussolini expanded into Africa. In Japan, military leaders invaded China. And all of them justified their aggression through a shared belief. The world order created after World War I was corrupt, Western-dominated, and ripe for collapse. World War II became the ultimate rejection of Versailles, not just militarily, but ideologically. Fascism, Nazism, and militarist imperialism all thrived by painting themselves as the antidote to the weakness and hypocrisy of post-World War I diplomacy. But as the war dragged on, the very powers that had once used Versailles as a tool of justification began to realize a hard truth: destruction doesn't heal humiliation. It magnifies it. By 1943, the tide of war began to turn. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union stalled in the frozen hell of Stalingrad. The Allies landed in North Africa, then Italy. British and American bombers lit German cities on fire. And back home, German citizens began to feel the weight of a war they had once cheered for. Still, the legacy of Versailles haunted every decision. Allied leaders like Roosevelt and Churchill debated endlessly about how to treat Germany after the war. Some argued for harsh punishment. Another Versailles. Others warned that doing so would only plant seeds for another disaster. Even as they planned the invasion of Normandy, the thought remained, how do you win peace this time? How do you rebuild without repeating the very cycle that led here? And here's the twist history never emphasizes. While the world fought to destroy Nazi Germany, it was also fighting to fix the mistakes of the past. In the Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam conferences, Allied leaders didn't just talk about battles. They talked about the future. They wanted to avoid another Versailles. So they began drafting something new, something different. They didn't call it revenge. They called it reconstruction. But before they could rebuild, the old world had to burn. D-Day. The Battle of the Bulge. Dresden. Hiroshima. Nagasaki. The war wasn't just military, it was psychological. The world had seen what unchecked vengeance could do, what political humiliation could unleash, and what happens when leaders sacrifice long-term peace for short-term power. In April 1945, as Berlin crumbled and Soviet troops closed in, Hitler retreated into a bunker. The man who rose by tearing apart Versailles now sat among the ruins of his own empire. He died believing Germany had once again been betrayed. And in a way, he was right, but not by foreign enemies. By himself. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. World War II in Europe was over. The cost? Over 70 million dead. Cities turned to ash. Generations traumatized. The Holocaust revealed in full, unspeakable detail. And the world knew, this time, peace couldn't be written in anger. It had to be forged in cooperation, humility, and truth. The Treaty of Versailles had created ghosts. Now those ghosts stood witness at the edge of a new era. But what came next? The post-war reconstruction, the creation of the United Nations, the dividing of Europe, would shape the modern world. And once again, Versailles would be the example, the warning, and the ghost that never stopped haunting. As the flames of war subsided, a new world emerged from the ashes of conflict, yet the scars were deep and lessons painfully learned. In the battered streets of Berlin and the rubble of Paris, leaders and citizens alike were forced to reckon with the legacy of a treaty that had once promised peace but had instead fanned the fires of violence. The Allies now faced the formidable challenge of constructing an order from chaos, an order that would prevent history from repeating itself. In the embers of destruction, the Allied powers gathered, not to divide spoils of war, but to map out the delicate process of reconciliation and reconstruction. They knew that the Treaty of Versailles had left wounds far deeper than economic ruin or military defeat. It had shattered national pride and sowed the seeds of bitterness. Determined never to make the same mistake twice, they held heated, sometimes bitter, conferences that stretched late into the night. The halls echoed with the voices of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, each insisting that peace must be built on a foundation of justice, cooperation, and above all, understanding of history's harsh truths. Amid these discussions emerged a vision of a world where, rather than punishing the defeated to the brink of collapse, nations would foster conditions for recovery and mutual respect. The process of democratization was placed at the center of post-war recovery. Germany, devastated by years of militarism and despair, was to be transformed into a nation that could, in time, be an active participant in a stable, integrated Europe. The leaders realized that true peace was a collaborative journey, not the victory of one ideology over another. At the heart of the reconstruction efforts was a new international framework. The United Nations was conceived as a platform for dialogue rather than dissent, a stark contrast to the League of Nations that had faltered in its early days. The hopes for a better future were not without skepticism. History had taught that treaties and organizations alone could not mend the deep fissures of human conflict. However, the collective aspiration for a renewed global order was undeniable. The narrative shifted from one of retribution to one of redemption, a turning point where the ghosts of Versailles were acknowledged and learned from. Back in Germany, the ordinary people bore the brunt of the interwar misery. The hyperinflation that had once turned banknotes into little more than kindling was now replaced by a resolute drive to rebuild. Families, having lost everything during the war and its aftermath, began the painstaking process of reconstruction. Small acts of defiance and hope combined with large-scale industrial recovery. The Marshall Plan, with its promise of economic assistance and tangible investment in Europe's future, was more than a lifeline. It was a symbol of international solidarity. In factories and workshops, in schools and community centers, the spirit of renewal was palpable. This effort was not just about rebuilding cities. It was about rebuilding the very fabric of society, which had been torn apart by policies rooted in resentment and punitive measures. Yet the scars of Versailles ran deep. In the hushed corridors of memory, survivors of both wars recounted stories of humiliation, loss, and betrayal. These stories became the raw material for a new historical narrative, one that no longer cloaked the errors of the past in the dust of forgotten treaties. Artists and writers, filmmakers and historians, all delved into the intricate web that linked peace treaties to the rise of radical ideologies. Their work would serve as a poignant reminder for generations that the consequences of diplomatic failures echo across decades. In quiet moments in newly built libraries, scholars pored over the clauses and conditions that had once seemed so decisive. Now, they viewed these documents not as relics of diplomatic triumph, but as cautionary tales, a blueprint of how to build a better, more humane system. Across the broader international community, the reverberations of Versailles were felt in the way borders were redrawn and conflicts were resolved. In Eastern Europe, the redrawn maps brought new challenges. The very process of carving out nations in the wake of an empire's collapse had left minorities vulnerable and interethnic tensions simmering. These tensions would require delicately balanced solutions, a constant reminder that peace is not merely the absence of war but the presence of justice and equity. Amid these intricate geopolitical changes, there emerged a realization that every act of retribution and every harsh measure taken against the defeated might indeed be counterproductive. It was a lesson learned too late by many, a lesson that would forever haunt diplomatic history. The spirit of collective healing slowly permeated even the bitter hearts of those who had once seen punishment as the only path to security. In rebuilding relationships between former enemies, there was an understanding that reconciliation could only come from acknowledging past wrongs without allowing them to dictate the future. The Treaty of Versailles, with all its punitive clauses and draconian measures, had inadvertently set a dangerous precedent. While it had ended one conflict, it also left behind a blueprint of punishment that inspired future aggressors. In examining the aftershocks of its provisions, the world collectively acknowledged that justice tempered with mercy was the only route to lasting peace. Trust was the scarce currency in this fragile new order, and every negotiation was a gamble on the bonds of shared destiny. In this post-war crucible, the global community faced a stark truth. The errors of history were not isolated incidents but interconnected threads in a vast tapestry of human behavior. The architects of the New World Order understood that the key to preventing further wars was not merely in redrawing maps, but in rewriting the narratives that had led to conflict. Education, cultural exchange, and open dialogue were seen as vital tools. They recognized that when nations learned to tell their stories honestly, the myths of revenge and superiority that had fueled past conflicts would gradually lose their power. This was the moment when the lessons of Versailles were not just studied in quiet academic circles but were broadcast to the world. Documentaries, films, and literature began to reflect a nuanced understanding of historical accountability, a critical evaluation of the belief that strict punishment could ever equal justice. The cultural shift was gradual but transformative. Where once there had been bitterness, now there was a cautious optimism and a commitment to a more interconnected world. Yet, even in the bright promise of the post-war era, the shadow of the past lingered like an ever-present reminder of human fallibility. The treaties, the conferences, the grand diplomatic gestures, all were tinged with the sorrow of what had been lost and the fear of what might yet be repeated. Every policy, every decision, every alliance formed was influenced by the lessons of that fateful peace agreement. It was a delicate balance between power and compassion, between sovereignty and global responsibility. And so, as the dust of war began to settle and the pieces of a shattered past were slowly reassembled into the mosaic of modernity, the world collectively vowed never again to allow history to be written solely in the ink of resentment and retribution. Every article of the Treaty of Versailles was dissected, analyzed, and debated by leaders who understood that true progress lay not in endless punishment, but in striving for unity and mutual respect, even among former enemies. The legacy of Versailles was complex. It was a legacy of cautionary tales and sobering reminders of the cost of arrogance and inflexibility. It was a testament to how policies born of bitterness can evolve into an incendiary force, igniting passions and shaping destinies. And perhaps most importantly, it was a reminder that the great debates of diplomacy and justice, forgiveness and reparation, are ongoing struggles, fights for the soul of humanity that continue to this day. As Europe took its tentative first steps towards recovery, and the world embarked on the long, arduous road to reconciliation, the tale of Versailles remained etched into the collective memory. It was a stark example of how a peace built on punishment and pride could never be lasting, and why a new kind of peace, one that embraced understanding over vengeance, dialogue over domination, was crucial to the survival of a fractured world. The Treaty of Versailles was supposed to be the last chapter of war, a full stop after the bloodbath of World War I. Instead, it became a prologue. Its signatures didn't bind peace. They built a cage, locking the future inside with ghosts of anger, humiliation, and revenge. And though the ink dried in 1919, its consequences rippled for over a century. Even now, Versailles is a warning that echoes across every peace negotiation, every failed ceasefire, every collapsed nation. Because Versailles wasn't a war-ending treaty. It was a war-delaying one. When the 20th century closed, the world stood at a crossroads once again. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Germany was reunited. The Cold War had ended without a nuclear catastrophe. It felt, for a moment, like history was healing. But healing isn't forgetting. And peace, real peace, requires the courage to remember how fragile it truly is. In many ways, Germany's rebirth became a model for how the world could confront darkness, not by hiding it, but by exposing it. In cities like Berlin, you'll find more memorials to victims than statues of conquerors. Where other nations celebrate power, Germany builds silence into its streets. Names of Holocaust victims are etched into sidewalks. Walls that once divided are preserved not to honor what happened, but to make sure no one forgets. And this was only possible because, after World War II, the world chose to reverse the formula. Instead of punishing a people, it held the guilty accountable and gave the rest a future. It offered food, not fines. Blueprints, not bayonets. Dialogue, not diktats. But while Europe rebuilt with American dollars and Marshall Plan optimism, the Middle East simmered in the chaos Versailles helped create. The lines drawn by imperial hands, lines that sliced through tribes, languages, and centuries of coexistence, still bleed today. Conflicts from Iraq to Syria trace their roots back to arbitrary borders signed into existence by men who never walked the land they divided. This, too, is Versailles. The failure wasn't just in how Germany was treated. It was in how the world misunderstood power. The victors of World War I tried to impose order by force. But history doesn't obey power, it reacts to it. For every humiliation written into a treaty, history writes a backlash. And in that backlash, dictators rise, flags fall, and lives are lost in numbers too staggering to count. And yet there's a second lesson here. One not written in treaties, but in the silence after. A lesson that emerged from the ashes of Dresden and the silence of Auschwitz. A lesson about what peace really demands. It demands restraint. It demands empathy. And above all, it demands memory. After Versailles, the world tried to forget. After World War II, the world tried to remember. That difference may be why we've avoided another world war since. But the memory is fading. Today, across the world, nationalism is rising again. Borders are being hardened. Treaties are being broken. Democracies are flirting with authoritarianism. And once again, many are turning to history not to learn, but to justify. To relive. To repeat. And the warning signs feel familiar. In times of crisis, it's easy to seek scapegoats. To long for strongmen. To believe that treaties are weakness and war is strength. But history doesn't honor strength. It records its failures. Versailles teaches us that peace, when built on humiliation, breeds monsters. That a treaty without justice is a time bomb. That punishment can feel good in the moment, but often costs more in the years to come. The Hall of Mirrors in Versailles was chosen for its symbolism. It was where Germany declared its empire in 1871. So in 1919, the Allies forced them to sign their defeat there, a gesture meant to humiliate. A poetic full circle. But history has a cruel sense of poetry. Because in 1940, Adolf Hitler returned to that same location, not to sign, but to force others to. The French surrender was signed under his boot. And the hall that once echoed with promises of peace now thundered with revenge. There's a reason that moment, silent, cold, choreographed, was filmed by the Nazis. It was the revenge Versailles wrote into their bones. We often speak of peace as something permanent, as if a signature can secure it. But peace is not a signature. It's a discipline. A promise you renew every generation. with education, with humility, with the willingness to learn, even from your own guilt. So what does Versailles teach us now? That peace cannot be dictated. It must be negotiated. That the defeated must be given a future, not just a sentence. That humiliation is a seed. And under the right conditions, it will grow back into fire. The treaty that ended World War I didn't end war at all. It just paused it. Deferred it. And when war returned, it returned bigger, crueler, and more global than ever before. But it also returned with lessons, etched into stone, printed in history books, whispered through generations. Lessons that may be the only reason we haven't repeated the same mistakes again. Yet. Because the ghosts of Versailles are still watching. Waiting. And if we forget them, if we ignore them, if we once again try to write peace in the language of power rather than the language of people, they'll rise again.